All right, recording has begun. So thanks everybody for joining us for this very early morning on the Pacific Coast edition of the Knative steering meeting. I know we're continuing the conversation from Tuesday. Sorry, days this week have been really tricky for me. I think, Ron, do you want to kind of fill us in on where we are?
Yeah, so when we last left off, we were looking at a Google Doc, and I want to thank Evan. I don't see him on my grid, but I think he's here. I want to thank Evan for turning it into a PR very quickly, which has allowed all of us to incorporate. I think the main topics of conversation and comments that were on the Google Doc have now also migrated into PR comments. I am not 100% sure. I did not do a careful QA of that. But I'm guessing that everyone who has a topic they care about, they've added as a comment. There are quite a few of them. I've read through most of them, and we have a couple things we need to do. Number one, I think it's about 4 weeks ago that PR 214 came up. We as a team agreed that we wanted to take time to consider it over a 4-week period, and bring it to a convergence. So we need to start to converge, and I'm very much motivated to do that, so that the entire community can settle on a way to govern Knative, and we can go work on software. I see Paul's nodding because I do see Paul. I don't know if you wanted to make a comment. So that's the spirit in which I want to answer some questions and get us going to. And I think Ben said this a couple of weeks ago. Like, hey, can we get back to focusing on what we need for our software? Paul?
Yeah. So I'm happy to go and close 214 as my own sense of the conversation is that it's not centered around 277. I'll just go and do that now. And the nice thing about Git is it's all in there. We can get whatever back, but I'll go ahead and close it for the moment. So I think as far as my own couple things I want to mention. As far as 277 goes, like, I think probably the most important details to sort out are how the trademark committee is composed. What do we understand to be the core scope, I think, is one that Brenda raised. And like one thing that I think is important is to be able to model, like, over maybe 1 year or 18 months, say that we have some folks from vendors that aren't engaging right now begin to engage, and like play that movie forward 12, 18 months and see how maybe the composition of like any of these committees can change, just so we all are like on the same page around those exercises. As far as 277, I think those are my main thoughts. One other thing that I wanted to put out there before we probably switch the conversation onto 277 is that we had identified yesterday, I think it was, as like we'd like to drive things to a resolution. But since we've had so much progress this week, I would like to like at least give 1 more week for things to settle. I do think that like probably this whole arc has folks that maybe like a heightened emotional charge, and one of the things I want to do is give us all a chance to take a breath, think carefully about stuff. We've done a lot of work to get here, and also want to give some time for folks that maybe on the periphery of these discussions or monitoring them to give thought to what is in 277. So I think that's what I wanted to say, if that makes sense.
I think that's reasonable, as long as the participants here are all comfortable with that. I mean, we made I'm just making sure that we're doing that because that's what everybody wants, as opposed to anything else, because we made everybody a promise that we won't take them through this long process. That's all. I know everybody's got proposal fatigue. So I think your suggestion is totally rational, and this is supposed to be a proposal for the community. So let's do that. As long as people like Jules and Jacques and all the people who are participating in this conversation are not saying, "Oh God, don't keep this dragging on."
I mean, this is all I look forward to in my way.
Okay.
But
Merry Christmas.
No, we should make the right decision, and yeah.
Okay. Yes, I think Paul's suggestion is quite reasonable, just so we can dot our I's and cross our T's and get all the details right and make sure that we're happy with them. Yeah. Yeah, Scott, I like Scott's suggestion of time bounded again. I think we should figure out which of Wednesday or Thursday is a good time to meet next week. I humbly suggest that we make it a 30-minute meeting, because by then we should have things settled. We should identify the things that are truly important to us to talk about live, as opposed to some of the open questions, so that we start to prioritize what helps us converge. But I'm only saying that in the interest of convergence, not stifling conversation.
Yeah, +1. And in terms of day of week, the perception that I've had is that Thursday is more workable for folks on steering committee. So I'm totally cool with Thursday.
Yep. Scott's suggestion, thank you very much. We'll aim for sometime Thursday. Hopefully I've got one little thing I got to adjust, but I'll make it work. Okay.
So, sorry, unfortunately my schedule is not so regular. I can make either day work, but I don't have a need for it to be Thursday next week. Wednesday is slightly better, but maybe we can take the scheduling offline and just make sure it's clear for everybody by the end of the day.
Yeah.
Yep.
Wednesday is a hard no-go for me for some personal reasons. So.
Okay. Thursday it is then. Sold.
Okay. Let's see. I was taking notes as you were speaking, Paul. Composition of the committee was one topic, and course scope was the other. Those were the two top priorities. Shall we just take them in that order?
Maybe scope is easier to establish.
Yeah, I wish, I don't know if Evan's on yet. The reason when we had a public meeting around functions a couple of months ago, we had a conversation. There was also a comment from, I think it was from Brenda around, or no, actually it was from you, Paul, around giving a sentence or two about the notion of giving a 1 or 2 sentence description of extensions. We had a conversation around sandbox extensions and core, and I vaguely recall Evan capturing the definition in 1 or 2 sentences in those notes. I was madly scrambling to try to find those, but couldn't. And so I was hoping we could lift those up. And I saw Nia's comment that Evan is probably about 5 or 10 minutes away.
I guess a question I have for you, Ron, is like when you were writing down core and extensions, like what does that mean to you?
To me, core was serving eventing in our API surface, our present API surface. And extensions, I added a comment, I think just as this meeting was starting, was I was trying to capture what it could be, but items that we've identified would be perhaps part of the default distribution that are not in Sandbox. So we're not still trying to figure out how they would work and whether they make sense as part of the project, but make it into the default distribution, but are themselves not yet part of core. As the conversation we had around functions, where extensions would include something like functions as a distinction from core. And part of the flow that I think was in one of Evan's multiple documents was something would move from extensions when it's an initial idea that, say, for example, Vile brings as, for teapots. It then would move into extensions as we get more work in a working group on it, have something that's working, we have it in the default distribution. As that gets wide adoption and we all agree that we want to extend the scope of core to add it there, we could or could not. That could go either way. So that's the, I don't know if I'm answering your question, Brenda, so let me pause and let you.
Sorry, I was trying to find the unmute button. Yeah, that answers my question. I think it'd be great to clarify in the PR, like this is core, so then there's no ambiguous there.
+1.
Yeah, I would love some help in turning that 4-sentence or 5-sentence ramble into some tight language. But we can do that offline. I don't know if either you or Paul have the couple of sentences that I said that actually you think capture the essence of it.
We can pull it out of the recording.
Yeah, fair enough.
We'll add teapots in there or something like that.
We're gonna call it the teapot layer, aren't we?
I see a comment from Scotty in the chat.
Yeah.
Hey, as a question, so Ron, you've said default distribution a couple times, and I was just wondering what you meant by that, because Knative is just a collection of things that can be installed into a cluster. And so like to a person that's trying to integrate with this, serving might not look that much different than things in Sandbox.
Right, and I think at some point we may want to somehow characterize the moral equivalent of a default distribution such that it's clear to someone what they're getting. I mean, that way they're not just randomly picking from any item in the collection of things in the sandbox. And so I didn't mean that we would actually create an RPM that is the default distro, but rather some way of expressing that moral equivalent.
Yeah, I had a write-up of something that I think is very similar to what you're referring to, Ron, which is like a and Vile, I think this is something that, like, before I wrote it down, you kind of had this idea for a while of when we say like the moral equivalent, like basically a first-time user-friendly characterization of what we think the core things that are probably also represented in the conformance suite, or at least the conformance suite for the core, that you can like begin to crawl, walk, and start to run with, that has sort of been backburnered, but I think is essentially what we're all like describing, if that makes sense, Scott.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
I would assume that the conformance suite would, there would be a set of components and that gets run against, and that thing conforms or not. But it kind of sounds like there's a registration process and maybe certification or something in the long term.
Well, I hope it's not as heavyweight as what the words you used make it sound very heavyweight, and I hope that it isn't that, but I also hope that people don't need to go to the conformance suite to figure out which components to set up and which ones are still early, like in the sandbox. So I think it's actually, I like the way that Paul, you phrased it, in that it's about how do we help someone get started, what we think are the initial components that are good for a good first experience for the customer. And by the way, I think that's distinct from what's in core, because we might conclude that there is that extensions plus core is actually the set of things that would give users the best experience as we in the future add components that sit on top of the core that help improve that customer experience, that perhaps add some extra layers of abstraction over time that make some things easier. So that was my intent in describing a default distribution.
Yeah, and yeah, the original goal for that was, hey, I have heard about this Knative thing. It sounds sweet, but how do I taste it? And it shouldn't be required. Like step one, it's like, oh, go build your own cluster, set up all these different things, and so forth. So that was kind of the original idea for that. And I do think that if a user comes in and they have to start installing various pieces and understand how do you get them and everything else, we don't make it super easy. So we should be able to go ahead and help a user be productive in a matter of minutes, not read the books.
We want the 5 minutes to wow.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we're just like Kubernetes.
I was going to say Istio, but that works too.
I probably shouldn't have even said that because we're recording.
We all know it. It's
So
true.
many
Some
hot
of these
takes.
projects have too much, too many steps. We all know it. The ultimate goal is a good end user experience. So
Yes.
is everybody cool with that? Sounds reasonable. Okay.
Brenda, I think this was originally something you raised. Does it need more discussion here, or are we aligned enough
great.
that? Okay. So maybe we can work offline on plumbing that into the doc. I think it will be important to represent in the doc because the more specificity that we bring around that allows just higher quality reasoning to happen around that doc.
Along those lines,
agreed.
sorry, Ron. I just wanted to suggest, because we have had so many different proposals, I'm also thinking through of what happens when we say yeah, cool, this latest one's great, go merge. We really are getting to the point where we're going to have 5 different MD files that are going to explain these different things. So I'm wondering if we're at a point where it's good to kind of start doing a work in progress of here's the file that explains the steering committee, and here's the file that explains the trademark committee. And if that would be easier, Scott volunteered for the markdown committee. If that would be easier just for some of the feedback and, especially in thinking about making it easy to install when you're faced with a 10-page PR, it might be easier if people are breaking it down and can be a little more concrete in some of the examples, like you said. Sorry, words are hard.
I think what I heard, April, is some form of even an FAQ for some of the common ways that somebody looking at, for example, our MD might have. I would suggest that we, in the interest of converging, let's converge first, and then we can assign some folks to write those up. But I would like to get to a resolution and not have this be
Totally
a required. Nice, but
totally fair. I will volunteer to start doing some of that, and I'll make Scott help me because he apparently really likes the markdown. No.
I wonder if the community repo should do releases. So there could be a work in progress branch, and then the main branch is the latest release or something. And that might help collaboration in the repo, and you can have multiple mini little PRs, iterate and not have it be the law once it hits the repo. There's there's a period, because code doesn't work that way. We have a period of development, we find bugs, we fix them, and then we do a release, and then that's the thing we think is the shippable product. So maybe
it's a good idea. I think we should table it for after we solve this one, but I do like the idea. What was next?
Okay, so I think the next one is mechanics around composition of trademark committee. So may I suggest an exercise? that we can use to explore this. And mostly I just want to make a joke with the name of the vendor we're going to talk about, which I suggest as the Ville ICOS teapot concern, which we can just call the concern for short, or the VATC. So say that VATC is like, we're all in on this Knative thing, and we care about the mark, and they start, VAT is a tax, but that's not what we're talking about, Dave. So say they begin to make substantial contributions. I think, Alex, you had a comment in the PR for have the trademark committee or the KTC be maintained at the same cadence as steering. So that would be like once per year. And I think, say it's starting from October 2020. Sounds like in October 2021, something happens to maintain the composition of that committee. What is it?
So the process I was imagining was that the committee itself would meet and review who the vendor stakeholders are and add vendors to the committee. So the VATC would get added to the committee based on their exemplary contribution to the Teapots extension and their interest in building products on top of Knative. And there'd be 4 seats, with each seat having a veto would be the likely outcome. Over time, I could imagine the trademark committee might get more creative, or there might be a need for some vendor to step back from the committee because they're no longer engaged in the project. But I would expect, in the successful mode, this committee would slowly grow over time. I'm imagining that there won't be very fast composition changes here, but in some eventual future, you can imagine it being fairly different than it is today.
Yeah, and so I think the exemplary contributions in question are like over the last year prior to that, right?
Yeah.
I think is what was described in the document.
Yeah, and I think that
it already says something like that. Something like in the last year is what it says. I'm myself a bit biased to more of a longer term horizon, but I think last year is still a good signal about who has skin in the game and should be included.
Yeah, I would suggest that we change, just again, in the nature of being really explicit. Like we say for the 2020 year, we're going to do XYZ. Well, the 2020 year is almost over. So, maybe we're saying the 2020, 2021 year or whatever, but just to make it, I think especially for something like trademark, we should have some stability there. And so let's just make it really clear that like, it'll be, reevaluated in 2021, basically, for who should be added, essentially, if anyone. Not a guarantee that has to be added.
At the rate we're going, and not meaning to sound negative, I think October 2020 is a good timeline for us to instantiate this committee for the first time. And then 2021, we review that composition.
Time for longer meeting, so it's fine.
Yeah, and when we're counting those contributions, like here's the thing that always like my brain always has trouble with when we count contributions is there's contributions that are easy to count and get. There's contributions that are much harder to count, that don't surface into Git or don't surface into something that gives us like a built-in accounting mechanism, like cloud spend, like presence and influence in meetings that shifts things but doesn't surface into Git. Do folks have any ideas around on like what a rubric might be to count those? I won't say algorithm because that's very quantitative. So maybe rubric.
I will say every project struggles with this, and I think there are wow, I really need coffee. Numerous different projects and areas like the Chaos Project that are trying to create some sort of, calculation method. It's kind of like, if you get it, great, you'll make a ton of money. But until then, I think that this is kind of how I'm envisioning it is, you've got the three large, core contributors that are on the trademark committee. If we're reviewing this next year, and I think it's these people get together and say, all right, we recognize that XYZ, I'm sorry, is it I can't even remember the name, I apologize. Not VAT, but the same acronym. Thank you.
VATC.
Thank you.
Teapot Concern.
AKA
AKA
thank
the
you.
concern.
If we get together and say like, okay, the concern is, done a great job with like, being active in the community and presenting at every conference and spreading the word of Knative, but the code doesn't show it. Like, one of the things in the PR is that it's the trademark committee that's ultimately determining who to add. So I think that is like, again, we're automatically saying it's not expected to be, a mathematical calculation. It's this group of people, looking at it and who's involved, considering all of those factors, and then extending the invite. And I realize that, we want to have as much stuff firm as possible. It's just that there is no standard for kind of like how you measure those extra contributions. And I agree with you, they're incredibly important, and many people do a lot for a project and don't code. I just don't know of any way. So yeah, I think it is kind of it's a trust factor in the trademark committee to do that. And then I also think that absolutely, Evan, I think the rationale absolutely would be explained always. I would fully expect that. And I also think that along the same lines, like, I would fully expect the community to push back on the trademark committee and be like, why doesn't so-and-so get a seat? Like, that's totally valid. And I would expect that any project.
For the TOC election process, I think there's like a contribution thing, and then there's like an exception. So it says something like, we recognize that this might not capture it. If so, you submit to this and we'll make an exception, right? Maybe there's a similar thing here, right? We've got criteria, and then we say, we know these aren't perfect. If you qualify, then by consensus of the trademark committee, we can override the criteria.
Absolutely. I think we've got that in place for, like you said, for voting and other criteria. I don't think it's hard for the concern to, kind of make their proposal for like all the awesome things they've done, and, filter it out for the community to see.
Right, but that would have the advantage of, like, we wouldn't, like, the fact that there are exceptions doesn't mean we can't codify the kind of, the golden path or whatever.
And I would also say, like, not that we want to go through this process again, but like, I always say that all governance is a living document, and like, it constantly evolves as the community evolves. So, we're looking we kind of have to pick a starting point and, modify as it goes on, but it's kind of like, what can we do to settle some of the open questions? And then, like Ron said, get back to doing great software. Y'all get back to doing great software. You don't want me coding. I will break everything.
Yeah, so I like the application of the exception process. This is actually like one of the key details that we're discussing right now that I think is going to be important to have defined, so that, like, if there are folks that are waiting to see how this all shakes out before they engage, like, I'd like them to be able to make a call about whether they think it gets the job done for them. So yeah, I think we can just say there's an action item in the air, maybe to like incorporate the exception concept into how that committee's composed. Sorry, just reading Evan's thing. Does that sound okay to everybody?
Today it sounds reasonable.
Right. We'll come up with. Can you just repeat it one more time, Paul? Because my audio broke up just a little bit and I fumbled to get to the unmute button.
Yeah. So the action item is to plumb in the concept of this is how we'll count contributions, and this is sort of the golden path. And we recognize that the golden path is not capable of covering all scenarios. So there's an exception process so that, you know, as we approach that milestone in October 2021, that like the concern, if they've influenced things a lot and done a lot of contributions that just don't surface in a way that's easy to count, can articulate in writing probably why they would like consideration for a place on the trademark committee.
Okay.
One other thing that was in discussion that I didn't get into the PR was size of the trademark committee, which is related.
Yep. I think that the PR as it stands has an initial size of 3. But as a couple of the comments hinted at, that is not a constant, expected to be a constant number. As the contributions in the community grows, the trademark committee can grow. And so I think maybe there's a one-word edit to your PR, Evan, which is in the composition where it says, identifies the initial 3 members, the founding members, we use the word initial.
The question I have there, is this a threshold you need to cross before you join the trademark committee, or is it proportional?
My inclination is threshold, not proportional, because proportional would wind up keeping the committee at a certain number. So I would go with threshold over proportional as our project and community grows. That threshold would mean 6, 8 members, and that would be fantastic. That would actually be good news for all of us.
Cool.
Scott has a question around, does KTC get veto power over trademark donation? No, it does not.
It maybe depends exactly what you mean by veto power. I think the KTC, as we've defined it, is well structured to enable the community to influence how it advises the trademark holder, and that advice will carry a lot of weight. And so I think in practice, they essentially do have quote unquote veto power. But if we talk letter of the law, you know, nobody can dictate to the trademark owner what they do with the thing they own. They own it. That's how ownership works. So I think the committee has a lot of power in this regard, though.
It would be nice to try to avoid another Istio situation, is what I'm trying to get at.
Right. I hear you, Scott, and I mirror that desire. And ultimately, yeah, go ahead, Alex. I think I know what you're about.
I'm familiar with the Istio situation, but in terms of the OUC, I think we would all want to see a track record of success and goodness that we were bought into before the trademark committee would want to recommend that. And so, we can all just relax and go drive our own destiny and kind of eat our popcorn and watch what happens.
Nice lampshade trope.
I think one thing that came up that I heard, but it's not written down, so I just kind of wanted to clarify. It sounded like the trademark committee is the decision maker on who gets to join the trademark committee.
That's right.
Cool. I know that was one of the things we had to do from Tuesday, so I wanted to make sure that's captured down somewhere.
Yeah, we can clarify it more in the PR. I don't know if you have thoughts, Evan. It says like the committee will review the composition annually and update. So, and it also says like only the committee can decide who's on the committee, basically. So, we can make it more clear if need be, but I think that's already in the PR.
No, I think that a bunch of the discussion that we had here should go into the PR. I didn't know what the actual values that we decided on there were. So rather than anchoring the community on some words that I jotted down in 5 minutes, I left it deliberately vague. But the fact that we're talking about it's a threshold, and so the number of members may change over time, and that non-code contributions, there's an exception process that could mean that you could get in there, even if you're, I gave a hypothetical looking at dev stats of like, say, 5,000 or 10,000 contributions. If you were if it was, the bar was 10,000, you were at like 9,000 and you'd done a bunch of other, intangible stuff, I could imagine, being like, oh yes, you get bumped over because X and Y and Z. It's a lot easier if it's a threshold as opposed to if you get in, someone else gets out.
I just want to recognize, Carlos, you pointed out we're not taking notes in the agenda doc. I pulled it up. I'm going to try to get notes for key things that we've put, that we've spoken into that doc. So if other folks could give a hand and make sure that those are accurately presented, I would appreciate it. Thanks for pointing that out, Carlos.
I'm going to let someone else get the formatting in, and then I'm going to work on the attending while someone else records the agenda. Keep going.
I think I am failing to remember the first action item. The second one was plumb in the concept of exception for eligibility for KTC representation. I'm sorry, I'm failing at this moment. Oh, clarify core scope.
Core scope.
There we go.
And the most important before that, we'll go make some edits offline towards a 30-minute meeting next Thursday, as it will be called the Scott meeting, to complete the convergence. Actually, the first decision.
Oh, please go ahead, Scott.
No, sorry. Is the Scott meeting me? What do you?
No, you're just the one who suggested we time box it to, and then I inferred from that 1 week. So, so it was your comment on me, but I think you're going to chair the meeting. I'm joking, of course.
Another thing that I'm realizing that I put a comment in that I thought it would be good to discuss is two things. One is it seems like the KTC has basically an obligation to review PRs that affect the characterization of core, but probably more frequently affect API surface in projects that are part of the core, and affect changes to the conformance suite. So things that affect the suite. In order to do that, it seems like there has to be, like, ideally folks that are on KTC are active in the community as individuals, so that they have the context and the familiarity with the processes around those things. I think it will be meaningful to characterize those in the content that eventually goes into the repo, and like what responsibility does the KTC have in terms of turnaround on those PRs and stuff like that. Do we have any thoughts about that, folks? Like, want to share?
Well, one suggestion that I thought you had made, but maybe it was someone else, that was made on Tuesday, was that maybe this doesn't need to be done on a blow-by-blow, PR-by-PR basis, but maybe on a release basis or something like that, where the goal of the KTC is just to approve the shape of the next release. Now, I think that there's danger there, but I overall like that approach. The danger is that we could potentially go off and work on a release that contains a bunch of things that suddenly at the last minute raise objections from the KTC. We don't want that. So that's no good. So it has to be maybe a little bit finer grained. But the idea of like sort of staying out of the way of the day-to-day operation of the project and enabling the KTC to provide their oversight on a coarser grained schedule seemed good to me. And then in terms of being active, the KTC members definitely have to be competent to actually go in and look at things and comment and stuff like that. But it also would be reasonable to think that they're representing their organization, and their organization should have that day-to-day visibility, and so they should be able to also be advised by other people in their organization to provide their sign-off.
Yeah, I think what I tried to characterize on Tuesday was the notion that I think the release boundary is what drastically raises the energetic bar. If like something slipped past that someone on, or one of the vendors represented on the committee is like, oh, that actually is something that we'd prefer to veto. I think the release boundary is like when those things kind of crystallize or solidify. Ideally, that's like an exceptional case. So I think the default mode is best if it's responsive to individual PRs, but I view like the boundary of a possible revert being the release boundary, if that makes sense.
As a sort of alternate way that the KTC could manage a lot of this without necessarily needing to get into the PR level, still having, authority to do so if they needed to, would be to have kind of a set of questions that they ask. So I've worked with Max Ross, at Google, who for every launch has like 3 questions. It's like 3 or 5 questions that he's going to ask for that launch. And you know what they are ahead of time. And it's basically like, is this potentially going to hurt any of our existing customers? Is, one of those questions. And so, how's the worst that this launch could go, is another, as an example. And I could see KTC deciding that that's the right set of, questions. And they want to make sure that you've done that, and they can go in and look at the PRs if they need to verify. But they really want to make sure that, hey, if you've added this to conformance, you have talked to these, 6 people, 6 technical people, and they've all said, yeah, that's a good idea. And if not, they'll veto it and say, you got to go talk to these technical people.
I guess another permutation that could potentially work is if KTC is meeting at the beginning or before the beginning of a release cycle and looking at roadmap items and saying, this one we act, this one we act, this one we act, this one we can't act right now because it hinges a lot on the details, and maybe what is in the roadmap isn't specific enough to make a determination on. And this one we knack, like maybe there's a way to do this like before any development happens, or before that like critical emotional point in development is reached, so that folks can have a sense of certainty as they're working on these things, versus after we've already nurtured the baby in the PR, having to approach KTC. So maybe there's another permutation that can work.
I'm not sure if this works the same for all manner of changes. Like for some things, like let's say a minor change to the API shape, what you're saying sounds totally reasonable to me, Paul, that it could act quite early before there's any development. But I mean, I really don't want the KTC to be able to stifle innovation in the project. I want the TOC to be able to start a working group to explore teapots. I want the VATC to be successful and earn its spot. But right now, teapots don't sound like a good idea to me. So, but who am I to stop that innovation and make it not happen? So there are going to be cases where you're going to have a group that's invested in their thing, and we've given them the license to experiment via the TOC, and they've gone and experimented. And at some point, the TOC has flipped from this isn't an experiment to this is something we like. And then now suddenly it becomes a matter of discussion about whether it's an extension or a core thing, and that winds up going to the TMC. But I don't want to stop that. So for things that are kind of more routine, I think what you're saying about having some sort of pre-approval type point is great. For things that are more innovative, we don't want to stop those things because we've created this process for adding to core.
Yeah, and I ack and affirm what you're saying. It seems like probably like the things that take the most consideration are additions to the core scope, right? Rather than features in existing API surface. And my own personal subjective opinion as an individual is that I think that even the notion of core sometimes makes weird incentives. There's a lot of like everybody has their different context in open source for like what does that even mean, and like what emotions have they felt around it in the past. So my own personal disposition is like let 1,000 flowers bloom, but we definitely have to act that there is a strong desire in the community for a process to make things part of core. So that's just kind of the balance that the KTC will have to strike. Right.
Right. I mean, I think on Tuesday, Evan asked people to come up with a different name for core, and I'm not sure anybody proposed any different names in the PR, but actually I think naming could matter here to sort of get away from some potential baggage around the word. Yeah, I definitely don't want to make core the target that everybody aspires to get into. I think that's ultimately bad for our project.
Quite possibly controversial opinion here, but we've talked about how Knative is a series of components that you can use independently but work well together. Could we just do conformance for each component and say we have serving conformance, we can license Knative serving, we can't license Knative as a whole because there's no such thing. There's serving and there's eventing, and maybe at some point in the future there's teapots. But if teapots cause a particular vendor trouble, they can still be serving and eventing and still license the trademarks for those. And that avoids we have a core and you got to get into core. We have pillars that we support because we know what they are. And we have other stuff that we don't know what it is yet. And so, no, you can't use the brand there because we don't even know what that brand is.
Yeah, and I'm with you, Evan. I think maybe my own characterization of that would be that extensions seem like it should be fine for an extension to have a conformance suite. So whether or not that extension is in any kind of essential grouping that we say is aligned with the mark, that if many vendors want to make a product that incorporates that extension, it can have its own conformance suite. to establish that those different offerings are interoperable.
Well, and Carlos makes an interesting point that there might be some vendors who only want to offer one of the components. I could imagine, for example, Confluent might want to only sell you Knative eventing, and they might not want to sell you serving because they sell you a eventing product that's built on Kafka, and they don't have a compute thing at all. But I also think that's something that the KTC should figure out.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't think we need to write into the charter how they do it. I just want to say that maybe core isn't even the right model.
Right.
Just to state, sorry, carry
Go
on.
ahead. No, go ahead.
Okay. Just to say, so I really like that. I think that is the right thing to do. And the only thing I worry about is if we don't have core, then we don't have not core. So with core, the nice thing is it's very clear it doesn't apply to extensions, right? But if there's a set of things that are and aren't controlled by the KTC, if you see what I mean, who decides which new thing does and doesn't need approval from the KTC if there isn't a core word that it is or isn't in. I don't really want to argue against this because I think it's the right thing to do, but I don't know the answer to that question.
I can imagine a world that sounds a lot like this, but maybe is not quite the same. So maybe I'll share it and see if it matches up or not. Like, let's say we have the Knative mark, and the Knative mark corresponds to Knative core, whatever that is. Let's call that for now serving and eventing. And then there's a new thing that we want to have, let's say functions, for example. I think it would be perfectly reasonable to say, oh, well, we want to create a derivative mark for Knative functions, and that could be a separate component that not everybody has to ship, and here's its conformance suite, and here's how you get to use that derivative mark. And then the KTC, all it needs to do is approve that derivative mark and say, yeah, and that's going to be controlled by whoever controls that function's conformance suite, which is not necessarily the KTC, but a separate extensions thing, right? So if that sounds like what you're saying, I think that's executable.
I'd actually rather have the KTC control so that it's consistent in terms of policies and so forth on things like conformance. But I would expect that, functions, if it's the example, would be responsible for implementing the conformance suite. But then it would still go through the rest of the KTC process.
Sure. I mean, as long as it doesn't create some kind of conflict, I'm comfortable with that. I think that sounds okay.
I mean, that would be my personal preference.
Interesting. I mean, just to say this out loud, right? That means we've made the KTC more powerful in the last 2 minutes, which may well be fine, given the KTC is much more representative and whatever now. But it's interesting.
Well,
I don't think we have to follow. Like, I think this is something we can do. We don't think we have to decide it a priori. But to sort of riff on what Joel,
I agree with that.
It is possible that there could be inter-vendor conflicts as a result of putting it all in the KTC. Whereas if it's just a derived mark that the functions group has control over, there's less room for that. So that's what I meant by, as long as it doesn't create conflict, I'm comfortable with this going to the KTC.
Fair enough.
If it creates conflict, I think we might need to work something different.
And I think paraphrasing Evan's point, and I think it makes sense, is that we can kind of, the KTC always has the ability to delegate it out. So maybe we just say, well, the KTC owns it by default. And if the KTC wants to delegate its control to a derivative mark for functions and avoid any conflicts, one vendor says, I'm not going to do functions, I don't really care about it, we'll devolve that down. That's probably a reasonable solution.
Right.
Okay. So we're about at time. I think we have two solid AIs and maybe a third one forming in the accretion disk. But the first two, clarifying scope. Evan, I heard you put your hand up to plumb that into, and I think that's fine. But I'd like maybe Alex, Ron, or April to affirm the changes that Evan makes. And I will take the second one, which my poor brain can't even remember that one, the exception mechanics, and I'll just ask for a similar affirmation on that one as we plummet in there.
You gonna do that as a PR on my branch?
Yes, I will make you a PR to your branch that already has some commits for me in it.
Yes. And we'll get CLA bot worked out at some point, and or just ignore and rewrite all the history and
beat the bot.
Make it all be April.
We have to. Don't worry.
I want to make. Thank you, April. I want to finish with two things. One, I want to thank all 21 people who are on the call, and I want to say close to 10 people who were on it and have dropped off for the other meeting. This has been a hard process, and I am confident that it'll be good for the community and for the project. And I look forward to converging. The thing that I think we can all do is work through the comments and start to be aggressive about closing them. If this is something that you think should hold up ratification, then leave it there. I'm not asking to unnecessarily close things, but if some things are not the most important, let's move on and let's get to convergence. I think we all want that. And because I'm hearing it here and I'm seeing lots of thumbs up on the screen. So let's go close this out.
Yeah, I think it's in our best interest to close out the action items from today, so that we can get the highest quality payload for folks on the periphery to think over. That's a very meaningful signal that I'd really like to get. So and I'll just echo your thanks, Ron, to like all my colleagues on steering and all of my open source colleagues in our community. Thanks a lot for everybody's participation in this.
One more request. If anyone sees places that do need more detail in the current proposal, just drop a comment in the PR, just a top level one, because I'd really like to make sure that we've got those details lined up. Leaving things fuzzy doesn't seem to have been in our benefit.
All right.
Okay, sounds like we're closed. All right, everybody have a great day. I guess we'll all hop over, or maybe some of us will hop over to the community meeting. I'll see you there.
Bye.
All right, take care. Bye.